Yeah, thank you. I will just introduce you very briefly. We have the pleasure to have with us Susan Usawa, uh, very very appreciate colleague and friend that we also shared a journey. We started our working together in the Kaunas University of Technology in the chair for impact of Industry 4.0 in industries. Susu is a researcher, a professor with a very long experience in China, uh, Australia, Finland, Spain, so very, very broad, and specifically, or among others, on sustainability and systems thinking. And we're very happy to have you here, Susu, in this webinar of Erasme, and the floor is yours. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Manuel. And Manuel is going to drive my slides because of technical things.
Yeah,
So
sure.
basically, I'd like to this morning talk about several things. And thank you, Morteza. Your talk weaves beautifully into what we're talking about, the social acceptance and the societal impacts, because it is a very difficult area to research and report on and quantify. These are actually some of the points that I've been struggling with for more than a decade, well over. So this is actually an important aspect, and because it's actually an applied area, it makes it difficult because those applications vary from situation to situation. So this, I'll be sort of referring to these conversations that we had in Morteza's previous conversation because I think it's really relevant. So we'll go to the first slide. If you can just go to the first slide, if it's working. So the general overview, I'm going to give a history of CSRP Institute only because it was a spin-off from a major project in China. And I'll be referring to several different case studies throughout this little chat because this is really relevant about application and getting to understand the aspects of the longitudinal work that needs to be done to get a grasp of the qualitative, the transitions between qualitative and quant, which are actually almost blurring these days. So the knowledge system is an important aspect, and the implementation and methodology, the application, and what's happened in the past and what's happening now, and from the view of a longitudinal approach, and the societal evolution, the emergence, and what that really means. So the CSRP Institute was a very important aspect of setting up a major project, and we dived into those areas throughout an entire little city. Well, little in China's, like 5 million. So it's quite large, but it's small in the scale of things. Um, During this period of time, we delved into all aspects in terms of the whole government, business, CEOs, small, medium enterprise, the entire range. Individuals, scholars, students, teachers, professionals, workers, all sorts of areas. So it was a really rare insight, actually, to snapshot an entire sort of situation. We were permitted to do this over a period of 1.5 years. So it was very well funded, and so it was something that produced really good insight. So I'll just pop over to the next slide, and you'll be able to see. Let me see. The next one should be the social complex adaptive systems aspect of it, which is regarding, because complex adaptive systems is something that people talk about CAS, but the social complex adaptive systems has a completely different view. There's complex adaptive systems has a huge range. It's a very vast umbrella of ideas and disciplines and approaches. But in terms of the social complex, it is actually something that actually what we're trying to do the transition for the industry 4 and 5. So 5 is actually trying to do something about that type of process about the social aspect, which is what we're looking at. So the creative systemic approach has a focus of exposing the processes and those processes within the processes. So that's something that happens simultaneously across all the scales. And what I mean by that is in various different situations, you have scales within a process. I'll be going on further talking about this more in depth, but this is just to give you a snapshot. So in all living and non-living, even when there's different types of processes, this doesn't have to be, they can be inorganic, organic, any kind of process that actually have different aspects and scales. Why I talk about scales is because these are very important. Within a scale, there's frequency. There's also, and what I mean by frequency, I don't mean how many times it happens. I mean, over a period of time, it's more about a rhythm. So these are some of the reasons why it's actually quite difficult to capture this kind of information in any sort of quantitative, hard evidence kind of base, something that's easy to calculate. And we use these processes actually for a basis for that creative descriptor, something that can help you identify the systemic ecological, or we call it biological community. There's also a really big discussion going on about ecological community and biological. So typically ecological is more sort of like a larger, broader spectrum, but biological is very specific. So we need to understand the different knowledge networks that are going on between those two. So if you can go to the next one, please. So what was then and what was now? So because what's then, that's the past, and that's always happening, and it's always creating the past, present, and future continuously. In systemic thinking, you don't separate past, present, and future. It all happens at once. It's simultaneous, which is also why it's very, very difficult to model, calculate, present, communicate, and describe. It's really difficult to do all those things. So because it's a dynamic, it's living process, the data translates to knowledge, knowledge into information, information into wisdom, those kinds of things. And it's not a scale in that way. That happens spontaneously. So data is everywhere. And when you do something with that data and you calculate with the data, you actually then do this data and it becomes knowledge. So that transference of knowledge, and when you apply the knowledge, it becomes an experience of that landscape. And so the landscape could be something that refers to, for example, environment. But its environment is not a sort of a strictly an biological. You can also use this as a kind of an information environment. So there's also these terminologies that can cause, especially into interdisciplinary realms, and talking about those kinds of publications that we were discussing before, this is actually where confusion can happen because the terminologies actually mean very different things. So in systemic thinking, these are landscapes of information. So you can have discussion and process and analysis. So the transition between what has happened, what's happening now, and the future, it's all fluid. And this is also something that touches on the methodological approaches when you're applying these kinds of ideas and trying to analyze what's happening in the field, because qualitative and quantitative data starts to merge. Okay, so the next slide would be about the data of knowledge and networks. So it's not just information what we're looking at. We're looking at the application, the experience, and so applied experience, or the application of experience and its environment where it works within, and the information in order to achieve these results. These are discussions that have long been discussed within policy and process, but it's, as Morteza said just recently, it's interesting how there's a great deal of understanding that the social side of it, or the macro, is not actually being well represented, or somehow not touched on, because it is difficult to quantify. So the discussion, the conversation, analysis is also an important aspect of the data to the knowledge and the knowledge networks to how to leads on to the links between the knowledge and the networks. So the next slide. So we're talking about resilience here. So links between knowledge, networks, and resilience. So the knowledge, networks, and resilience is something that is its attribute to the social and so this determines future. And the reason why I'm talking about this is the fact that the attributes are trajectories. There's three, and this is what we've just found recently in an interesting part of some recent literature that we've been working on and reading and researching. The idea that there's resilience and there's different types of resilience. It's actually coming out now in recent literature and research that resilience has been sort of broadening, but it's not really well understood. It still needs to be, there still needs to be a great deal of deep diving. It's kind of frozen, but now people are sort of beginning to comprehend that the ability, adaptability and transformation is actually a really key aspect of what that happens within social sciences. But we're discovering that between like the computer sciences and other disciplines, this is actually not well translated. So we're seeing siloing, which is actually a really important aspect of why things aren't being well attributed and well understood between different aspects. So that leads us on to the link, the continuation of the networks and resilience. It really is seen as a biological perspective, and this has been going on for decades. The perspective, it's a really critical when you're reviewing such a complex system, and biological helps the comprehension actually, and it may be also a key for future credibility in terms of accounting and the measurement approach. So trying to do the quantitative rigor, because the biological aspect is it actually forces you to look at the system through a living, dynamic approach. So you need to be constantly appreciative of the fact that anything that you apply has to be dynamic enough to follow or reflect at least a representation of what you're trying to model or view or do. So the very best that we've come up with so far, I think in the broad spectrum of the literature, is snapshotting what has happened over a period of time, which is what I was talking about before with Morteza in the questions. So this brings us on to the sort of the organizational knowledge system. So this in this next slide, the organizational knowledge systems, it's like this sort of, stool where you can sort of like sit on it. And this is actually three-pronged approach is actually one of the most stable structures. So if you're leaving out any of the structures, and that could be infrastructure or physical structure. So this is, it could be various different structures. The processes are very important, people, individuals, and groups. So this is from a human point of view, but you can replace the people or the individuals for other entities or organisms from a biological sense, and you'll still have the same kind of understanding of the organizational knowledge systems. So there's a great deal of literature that sort of has been discussed around this structural processes. So this goes from sort of management and organizational thinking right through to biological and computing and various other areas. So it's an interesting point of view. So to break it further down, the next slide shows the workshop case study, and this is knowledge in action. And if you just if you just keep clicking, you'll see the problems, the problem place. There's the problem environment space. Then you've got the problems and the resolution. So the big egg represents the project environment, and the smaller egg represents the personal knowledge. So that would be the small egg represents the individual, so the information and the experience. So there's a tight knit between the information experience for the individual and the personal knowledge. And personal knowledge doesn't necessarily relate to just one person. It can be a group, an entity, an organization, and something that's smaller. And keep going, you'll see the arrows start clicking. They'll just keep clicking, and you'll see how they click to different areas and how that works. So yeah, so that's how that sort of generalized, a very general representation of how that sort of moves around. So the next aspect of this understanding is the difference between the knowledge and the information. So what are we trying to manage? So this is actually talking about that management of the technology push environment leads to an aim, and it captures and records knowledge. But you have to understand, is that a worthy goal? Is that something that you really want to share? Is that the information sharing rather than knowledge sharing? So these are questions that you really need to come up and understand, that this is actually something that perhaps has not been really well understood. The difference between information and knowledge is usually and can be quite interchangeable within the literature, but this is actually not terribly accurate, because information is just that. It's just information. Until I have some knowledge, I can't apply it. I can own a book, but that doesn't mean that I can actually represent and reproduce everything in that book. It's only something to refer to. So you can appreciate a musical instrument, but that doesn't mean that you have the knowledge to play it. So this is actually really important. The capturing of, what do we actually mean by capturing knowledge? Are we actually capturing a high level of information? So the question between this knowledge and information is actually quite critical, especially when you've got the technological push and the environment to do this. So this is actually something very important from an application point of view and an understanding of the field of environment that you're looking at from a complex systems point of view. So the next aspect is what are we looking for? So what are we looking for in terms for the discussion? So the data is a set of values. Okay, we understand that. We understand that it's a set of values, and it has qualitative and quantitative variables. But these, from a systems point of view, this changes quite dramatically according to the perspective. And what I mean from the perspective goes back to talking about the levels and scales. So you have within a level, you'll have a scale, and in that scale, you'll have different characteristics and qualities. They kind of represent your different perspectives and your different viewpoints, because quite often you can be agreeing on something, and yet you're just seeing it from a different point of view, and people will disagree with you. So that seems very basic. It seems very obvious. But when you're working and applying this within the field in a case study, that's far less easy to determine and understand where you're at in terms of application, recording it from the field, creating your data sets, and also analyzing what should your unit of analysis be from a qualitative point of view. It's quite difficult. So this also then brings us to the understanding and the difference of data and information. So the next aspect, then the next slide. So data is a set of values that have these variables within them. And so whilst this seems very basic, the reason why I like to outline this is because these are kind of the steps that you need to be constantly focused on when you're actually trying to look at the systemic complex system in the field whilst you're doing an application of it. So the next slide will explain to you the different types of things that we've come across that have to be done all the time. And the next slide is also a picture of a nice community, which was an actual case study. This was an actual case study of an area within Melbourne, Australia. And the government actually asked us to do an analysis of the entire area. So much like the one in China, this is very similar over a similar period of time. Possibly about 10 years difference between the two case studies, yet the approach and the results were very, very similar. So that's very interesting because culturally they're quite different. The timescale between the two case studies is considerable, a 10 years period. And so it's interesting to see that the same types of attributes came through the complex adaptive systems, social systems showed up the same key elements, which was very interesting. So one of the preliminary mappings that we did very quickly is in the next slide there, mapping the process of the community. Just a very quick, what you'd call a sketch, just to show people. And then we did this multiple times, and sort of dug deeper and deeper and deeper. So this was just a quick one. So the next one is the silos that we showed before, this information sharing. So these are the eggs, but of course the organizational information cylinder, that actually could be any sort of organization. In this case, it would be the government who requested the information to be shared and analyzed in this case study. So this is one layer. So the information sharing, and as you can see, it's the same eggs, but the project environment egg could be reproduced many times, maybe 100 times, 1,000 times, depending on what projects are within that area. So the next slide then shows you the retail side, and same situation with the retailers. They're showing the different types of knowledge in terms of what they experience, how they are viewing it, what they are going through over a period of time during that 1.5, 18 months. So the community layer looks very similar, but slightly different. So this is the next one, the community layer. It has more personal knowledge and information. So there is that's where you've got the community layer, and you've got the skills, the personal, joint, past, present, and future, personal, professional. These are all the different aspects that with the FTG, that was actually part of the village. So that's the integration with we called it the FTG village, focusing on the longer term connections between different areas. And you can start to see different types of really specific information coming out in the community layer. And then we go on to the residential layer, and the residential layer has different aspects. They're more interested in recreational, just living, looking at different traffic, things that impact people on a residential layer, which, by the way, was different from the community layer. So you have a community layer and you also have a residential layer, because communities are made up of not just the community itself, they're residential, but there are people who, in this case, we called it residential. And it's very interesting, in the Chinese context, community means everybody, and residents are included within the community. They don't separate the two, but this was something that we did find. They separated the individual in a different way by family. So it was kind of different, but the results, the information was quite similar. So then we go to the historic layer, which is really extremely important. If you go back to the three-stool chair, without the historic layer, we don't have any depth. So the historic layer includes all the processes together, and it gives you a longitudinal depth. You don't have an anchor. Without the historic layer or something that corresponds with time, you cannot really formulate a longitudinal aspect to the research in terms of trying to quantify what's going on. So the historic or a time layer or something to do with a comparative analysis over a period of time is really critical for the qualitative aspect to be able to be understood in some sort of quantitative or numerical fashion. It's actually quite difficult to do that without it. And many research projects and case studies that I looked into over the same similar period of time between those 10 years, if they had no sort of longitudinal or time or historic layer, it was extremely important. It was extremely difficult for you to understand what was actually going on. You couldn't actually measure it. So I argue that, in fact, you can do quantitative analysis with qualitative approaches for social aspects and applications, but you just need to have a measurement that is actually constant in terms of the way in which you apply the longitudinal approach. The reason why it's so difficult, and the conversation that we had with Morteza, is because the fact that if you do this, it's very all situation driven. So we don't really have an overarching, apart from longitudinal approaches, which is very, very broad. It's very difficult to actually understand how to apply this in a really strict, repetitive fashion across a very broad spectrum. So the longitudinal or the historic layer of the timing is up against the rigor of a process that is much more easy in terms of quantitative to count and to analyze. So this is something that needs further work, and which is why I suspect we are actually having to now understand this, and the policymakers are understanding why the social aspect is not as well accounted for. So this brings us to what is the aim? What is the better aim? So what is the better aim of understanding and presenting? To enhance, the ability, the accessibility of community knowledge and corporate knowledge, community knowledge or corporate knowledge or organizational knowledge, whatever it is that you're aiming to actually show within the system boundary. And why do we say that within the system boundary? Well, that can be also representing the knowledge system boundary, the boundary of the community, whatever it is that you're scoping, in other words, the scope of your work. So the system boundary, it's where the system actually transitions into another area. There is at the edge of that system or whatever its self-determining process is. And within that system boundary are all the processes that are going on. So do we need to know about the system boundary? Absolutely, because this is where the transitions are happening. And in fact, the policymakers of those two different case studies that I briefly touched on needed to understand what was going on in their community from something that was actually intangible, it wasn't actually something visible. So it took many layers of analysis until we could find out what it was that was driving certain directions and behaviors within the community that weren't visible. They just weren't visible. So, so the next slide is actually quite technical, but this is it's fine. This is the hierarchical, complexity, and this is the emergence of the new levels. So this is what I've been talking about, that there's a higher level system or the environment, and then you've got the focal point or the holon within the system. So you've got a bottom-up process and a top-down process from the two arrows on the right there, the boundaries and the possibilities. And so these sort of create a pressure where there's a focal point, and this focal point is where the holon systems interact. And this is where I was talking about the layers, and within the holon and in the focal level, you'll get the different characteristics. There are really different characteristics of those different focal levels. So in some instances, people can be discussing something within policy or government and be at loggerheads with each other, but they may actually be agreeing, but it's because they've entered into the discussion at a different focal or level point, and their characteristics at that level, their perception, their viewpoints are quite different. So according to the different levels of which you're working at, this can be actually something that is causing conflict when there actually isn't any. So this is actually quite important to understand the complexity, and these levels emerge according to what going on in the community itself. So that's actually quite important to understand that has a huge impact. So it's interesting to see actually in policy and also in various governing issues, you can understand sometimes if you can see that they actually agree or disagree, but they're having a conversation on a different scale, different level from each other. So they can't come to grips with it because it's being processed in a sort of binary. So you need to remember that systems is not one or the other. It's a plural. It's a pluralistic approach. It's not a dualistic. And this is actually something that is also glossed over. So a pluralistic approach means that it's always got more than two. There's always something else going on. So this is actually really important in terms of systems thinking. And this comes into play, as I said, because you always have the bottom up, top down, the interactions happening simultaneously. So the next aspect of is the methods and the application and what to keep in mind. So this is actually just a quick. I won't dwell on this. I'm just simply saying that there's siloing that goes on because of these holistic whole-on points of view. It's typical in engineering because in engineering you need to be very, very specific because you can have things go very wrong. I mean, if you're building a bridge or flying a plane, I mean, there are really specific aspects that must be adhered to. Yet the horizontal, the way the information shifts and moves and know-how is actually at odds. So you've got the vertical of engineering and of knowledge sharing, and knowledge sharing is something that is dynamic, as I've explained. So you can knowledge, actually the knowledge sharing experiences can actually cross over those silos through a horizontal action, but and it can also, you need all of them actually. So a loss of know-how and information and experience is usually because it gets stuck in a silo and there's not enough crossing over. And a really classic example would be BA Systems, Boeing, where it's a human error. And it's because someone's bypassed a different process that they just think, no, I'm just going to bypass a process, and a certain bolt is not put in the right way, and the windshield of the plane falls off, and no pilots died, but it caused a huge incident with the plane. So human error in terms of these systems, it's very engineering point of view is there's no reason why you wouldn't follow protocol. But the problem is humans aren't rational. So they won't always follow it in the way that it was designed to do. Because a situation's going to present itself, there's going to be a different perspective point of view. The protocols that are put in place that are a different scale and level, they have different characteristics and they conflict with the person on the ground who is actually trying to apply it. So then you'll get a mismatch and you'll actually have an incident. And so this is just a classic knowledge management, in fact, but it actually has many more applications and issues. So these are some of the other reasons why it's really difficult to map and project what we're talking about in terms of following social systems. So just going quickly to the next slide, that's just another reminder of the membership of the group that represents the territory. And there's just some citations for you, but the membership of the group, it's a reminder to sort of say that within a large community or area, again, I'm reiterating the fact that the group is part of a territory. And so these are just some of the. Silicon Valley is a classic one. And so active clusters of complex systems, they're usually collectively tied together, you know, of personal networks, economy, economic relationships, explicit knowledge exchanges, tacit knowledge exchanges, all of this kind of thing. So this is happening all the time, whether we are aware of it or not. And this includes farmers, this includes agricultural systems, whole networks of small regions. I'm working on some projects in Spain for farmers in the Catalan area. And so this is very, very poignant for all the people who are interacting and the web of knowledge and interaction that's going on in terms of a territory. So a territory is a community on a different scale with various different other elements that are integrated within that. So this brings us to the next slide. So the basis of the knowledge system, I think we've done this, but this, I'm just saying for people, specifically for people, there's the knowledge attractor. There's the person who, or the entities who bring experts together, and they create communities of interest and then communities of practice. Interestingly enough, over the years, and I'm actually going to do some more analysis on this, it seems that on average, if a group gets together and they're developing something, a community of practice takes approximately 3 years to develop. I don't know why that is, but I've had this phenomena occur over and over again. I feel like I need to get into this much more depth, but this is actually very interesting process that happens. So the next part brings us into the first, this is a representation of a social network, just a visualization to help you visualize what I've just been explaining. So the top down is the higher level needs, the history, the circumstances, and history is important again, as I told you, because of the time factor and the longitudinal approach. So the inputs and outputs, and here we have like Manuel today, he's the human attractor here. So he's in the center there, bringing all the people together. So the next step too, you'll see there's a coalition of things coming to gelling, things coming together, gelling together. And in the community of interest, the COI, you'll see that there's a circle, and that's quite a solid circle. At this point, in the early stages of a community of interest, everything kind of comes together and people want to only talk to themselves, you know, like with the group that they know, because they're still finding out what they don't know, what they know, what is their boundaries. So this is kind of like the early stages of a community. And in this sense, community is it's a broader spectrum idea that community could also be a city, a town, a country. So it can be these images can be scaled up or down regarding, you know, what it is that you're focused on. So you'll see in the next step 3, in comparison to step 2, the circle becomes dotted and there's some space in between. This is because the interaction starts to flow from different aspects, and you'll see new people coming from the outside coming in. Some might go out, but then they're just interested, so they're just looking at this. So you start to see the lines inside the egg become more complex. Some are darker, some are lighter, depending on what level of interaction is going on there. These are all actually mapped from various different case studies over the years. So the next step 4, you can see sort of the autopoiesis, self plus production, very well documented in literature. So the higher levels and the history, same, it's all the same, but now you've got some of the darker faces there, and this is the different grades of interaction, those who are more solid long term, and then the others, there's differences just showing the different types of interaction. And so A, B, C, and D, they start to formalize different aspects of codifying, knowledge sharing, information creation, data sets. This is all starting to happen between the two, from the top down and bottom up. So yeah, So, and step 5 shows you the, I think the next one. Yeah, step 5 is this is where the semiotic process. So this is where autopoiesis, where you've got actual codification. So you've got documentation being prepared and shared. So knowledge is very well coalesced within the organization. As you can see, the egg remains fluid so that you can still move in and out. It's only at the very early stages, the egg quite solid when people are integrating, but then this is actually, okay, yeah. So this is it, and we can go next slide, and then we're just about done. We should be right at the end already. Keep going, keep going. There's only a few. So this is this idea of scale, which we've talked about. The next one, and I think that's pretty much the change of scale means the quality. Yep. And keep going because I've done all of this. This is all fine. And this is the one, the type error. The error type is something that you should be aware of, understanding, not producing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. So predictions and correlations, I think I've described very well already in terms of the statistical relationships and the correlations. This is the longitudinal aspect. And the next slide, reusing the data. This is for engineering. The correlations between reuse of good examples of doing search engines, but this is actually strong correlation discussion. So the next slide, and recombination of data. And that's where the socio-economic usage over a long period of time can be very important. And the next one. So this is when it's exhausted, like in Microsoft, but they found some strong correlations, but they reversed it. So this is an example of a different point of view, a different value point of view from a different proposition of within the Holland scale. Then the next one, datification. Very important because, as I've described to you, this is actually something that can't be overlooked. Datification has to come from all different types of data, all different sources. So you can't have the same thing over and over again. So it's really important that we try to look at data from a much broader spectrum, which is why I think we've run into the problems that we have. So this is actually a very important point. And I think it's very much near the end. So the next slide. And that's the last word on technology, just to prove my point. So when we put the deep sea telegraphic cable, the transatlantic cable, that was all done without modern technology. It's quite an amazing feat. And so I think that's the final one is coming up now. Should be concepts to be aware of. So yeah, these are the community things to be aware of. The various different contexts elaborated by literature, the dynamic inputs, the processes for linkages, and distinct characteristics. This is really important. And uncertainty and unpredictability. So you've got these are the different concepts: change, disturbance, uncertainty, and adversity. So there's a few more, but I actually want to leave it there. I think that's a good point to leave it on. Yeah, I think that resilience is a concept to be aware of within the community, and there's you see here there's different kinds of understanding of what resilience means: change, disturbance, understanding, adversity. But within those common known words lies all the social complex adaptive systems, approaches, and concepts that we need to apply when you're looking at it from an application and a field work point of view. So I have tried to explain to you the different types and approaches that we need to understand when we're evaluating different types of communities and how to approach and why it's not so straightforward. So thank you very much for your time.
thank you very much, Susu. I'm sorry for making you run at the end.
No, it's okay. It's
Actually,
fine.
you
It's
you
fine.
you run faster than I wanted. We have still time,
Oh,
but
but we can
anyway.
talk about it. That's fine.
No, I wanted really to have time to for discussion because I wanted also to
Mm,
make you to raise a reflection here.
mm-hmm,
I pretty agree on this need to handle these complexity issues, especially in social dimension, and this is a challenge. And as you previously mentioned when we were discussing with Morteza, we sometimes have this impression when we are doing research and we are submitting a paper and discussing with the editors that we are starting from scratch when we are presenting these frameworks, these methodologies. And here is my question, because I just found this very interesting paper regarding circular economy and specifically industrial symbiosis. Within industrial symbiosis, in the file of industrial ecology, which tries to make this analogy in between industrial biological ecosystems and industrial ecosystems. They make this analogy in between the ways in which industrial symbiosis are being reproduced. So how the impact of some existent industrial symbiosis will have an influence on the new emergencies of others. And then this very interesting paper from Denmark, from the university in Denmark, make this analogy in between the coral reefs reproduction types and how uh, industrial symbiosis reproduction types are influencing the emergence of other. And my question is, where is it the boundaries maybe of those analogies or those kind of comparisons when we are talking with complex social systems in order to have really a relevance into academic terms.
you've touched it right. You've hit it the
Yeah.
nail on the head. Absolutely. The lack of understanding of the boundary, the social system boundary. It's not just social system. It's a systemic boundary
Mm.
issue. So, in terms of systems thinking, it's not just social systemic thinking. It's systems thinking.
Mhm.
So, to comprehend the boundaries of within that or beyond that, that's a really clear way to indicate what it is that you're discussing. But you can never forget, while you're focused on whatever the coral reef, right? The
Mhm.
coral reef, and then there's a correlation with the industrial. Um, they can have similar behaviors, but you have to be very, very clear about what the boundaries of what they're working within are
Mhm.
doing. They'll cross over for sure, because industry, take the coral reefs in Australia, for example, in the Queensland area. The industry, the sugarcane industry, farming, has absolutely a huge impact on the coral reef. How do you analyze those two systems? You can't separate them. But what you can do is focus on it. So what you're focusing on doesn't mean that everything around else has stopped working. It's just that you focus on that area. So you need to be. It's a question of being able to define it really
Mm.
well. So if you don't actually define it, state your case, you know, create the awareness of what it is that we're talking about at this particular time, this is actually really important technique. And if it's not done well, it can be chaotic
Mhm.
because systems covers everything. So how do you focus and communicate on an aspect so that at least we can be on the same page? So like I always say to students, it's like It's like GPS. Systems like GPS. If I give you a street name, you're not going to know. It's not going to be any relevance if I don't give you a city. It has to be. It has to have some relevance. You can dive deep, but if you don't understand your position, so the positioning is super important all the time. But you can't forget the fact that it's only a position, and the fact that everything else is continuously, dynamically moving, regardless of your particular focus at any given time. So the way to sort of discuss it is all of these things, what the papers that are coming up are relevant, but what is their positioning within the bigger sphere? This is actually kind of a skill set that needs to be really well taken into consideration. Otherwise, your paper is relevant, but it's not attached to anything, and people don't understand what the relevance is. It could be a really good point, but it won't make any sense because it's not anchored in a bigger sort of position. So it is a sort of a GPS question, like you need to sort of focus on the GPS question, sort of like position your work and your thinking. Otherwise, people can't keep up with it. It's too much. And this is an issue when you're taking it to journal, because the journals want you to be really specific, and you usually have to fit into a theme or something like this of the journal, if it's a special issue or something like this. So you might not have very much flexibility. But this means then that you have to put something very abstract into a very concrete world. And it's very difficult to do.
Very challenging.
So yeah, totally. So one of the techniques you do is to do this GPS positioning, where you say within this sphere, this is a topic that's looking at this. I'm not saying everything else is stopped. I'm just focusing on this. But when you're working in this area, especially if you're doing PhD work or any of these knowledge, what I call knowledge thesis, or anything to do with knowledge, fluid knowledge topics, it's very difficult because you can lose yourself so easily because you're diving quite deep, and then you forget where you're coming up for air. You don't remember where the position is. So you have to find a technique of writing and applying that knowledge. So in terms, I don't know why they call it soft science, the soft systems, because it's really hard.
Really hard. It's not really soft. Yeah, don't misunderstand. I really found this paper and this research very, very attractive, very innovative way they are like making this analogy, and very, very practical applications could be taken out of this. But on the other side, there is a lot of criticism where why are you going to make a comparison or an analogy, because it's not a comparison, with a completely different system, and bringing some insights from the reproduction types and scams and behaviors of a different organism, which is like the coral reef, and bring it into a different context in the industrial ecosystem, which is industrial symbiosis. But still, I'm pretty appreciate your answer, because it's really true that having this focus, this anchor, and then exploring a specific topic will help you to make to not make it like a very ambiguous, to have a concrete topic where you are linking those. Thank you.
I really appreciate your point, because the short answer is, why do it? Well, because the outcome of the comparisons are relevant. They actually are relevant. You do get really important information from completely different systems to prove the point that there is a correlation between the way systems behave. And not just systems, those things in the system that you have outlined are in that particular focus. So this is important. And why it's so difficult is because you can get two very, very different things. And people think you're mad, because you're comparing two very, very different things. But the actual fact is, once you understand the code of system language, it actually makes perfect sense. So it is just that, and it's very qualitative in some instances, not always. It uses a combination, but because of the way in which it is not a linear, it is dynamic. So the non-linearity of this approach makes it very difficult to publish, to communicate, to show. A lot of the systems people are now talking about, we should be developing journals that are non-paper based. It would be much easier to do models, like, and not just models, drawings, representations, you know, because obviously, as you mentioned, this is not real. It's an analogy. It's a representation. But we need representations. Otherwise, how do we teach chemistry? I mean, you can't see chemicals, right? You have to draw them. So there's some way that we've struggled always with these sort of concepts. But systems complexity has brought in some really new challenges for science to kind of work out where to from here, you know. How do we do this? And it's not a coincidence that the industry 4 and 5 are having this issue of doing a patch and doing an upgrade and putting in new characteristics, for example, because they have to. There's something missing. It's not working. Morteza showed us very clearly, you know, in the graphs. So not all aspects are working. Not all aspects. So yeah.
Okay. So I don't see any hands raised for more questions. But I really thank you, Susan, very much for
thank you
being
for
with us,
inviting me.
for sharing
Yeah.
your presentation, for giving us this lecture, very interesting. And well, we will have a 1 hour break for lunch. So we will be back in the afternoon for this roundtable. So thank you very much also, Morteza and Susu, for accepting to join in the afternoon for this last hour. For this very interesting discussion that I'm sure we were gonna handle together and also with Aneta. So without further to say, I will leave you here by now, and see you soon. And thank you all who are connected for being here with us. Thank you. See you, Noah.
Thank you very much, Manuel. See you.